Okay, we're live, and I am here with Fountain of Comfort board member Gage Murphy, who is also a second year Masters of Social Work student. And we've been talking about all kinds of psychological stuff.
Yeah, we have.
So, what do we want to talk about that the people in this corner need to know about?
Well, there were a few threads that we said that we had picked up on that we said let's hold it until we get onto a stream, but now I'm having trouble
Well,
remembering.
one of the things we talked about, which I think is pretty important, um, and my cousin suggested that for Fountain of Comfort, we actually do like treatment guidelines, like an actual this is what we recommend,
Okay.
right? And I was thinking of putting it in there, which is that there needs to be a hierarchical system similar to what we have um, in physical medical health, right? Health, which
Yep.
is okay. You have a surgeon, you have a general practitioner, you have a primary care physician, you have a EMTs, you have nutritionists, and what you call it, nutritionists and personal fitness coaches, right? And there needs to be a mapping onto the mental health field, which is useful, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
Because as we were talking about, so there is depth psychology, there is like clinical, like being able to rip someone emotionally apart
Yep.
so that they can have a catharsis
Yep.
and rebuilding and resolution.
Right.
But i I think the analogy to surgery is very good, which is you like you don't just go around. What one of my rabbis once said, you don't go around um, with a knife cutting people's hearts out, except if you're a surgeon, right? Like,
Right.
and unfortunately, I think there's a lot of people who are just trying to have that cathartic experience,
Yep.
and it's like, are you sure you want to have surgery for no good reason?
Right. Right.
Um, and I think to some extent you can have, these cathartic experiences which do you more harm than good.
Yes.
Um, at the same time, I think we do need paramedics. We need people who know first aid, like mental first aid,
Yep.
right? And
Basic
that,
risk assessment,
yeah,
all within it. Yeah. Yep. Yep.
just basic. Someone's in crisis. How do you talk to someone in crisis? Someone's
Yeah.
having a schizophrenic episode. Somebody's manic,
Technical
depressed.
skills and demeanor. Yep.
Right. Yeah.
Yep.
And so part of my thinking was that um, we certainly want to at least have peer counselors and mental health professionals. And frankly, I think any unit needs to ultimately be under the supervision of a psychiatrist. This is part of the reason I do want to work closely with my cousin who is a psychiatrist, is and we have very similar ideas.
Okay.
Is I do think the biological aspects of mental health are just not being adequately addressed at all.
Well, in my social work program, not at all.
Yeah, yeah,
I mean, even bringing up basic, in some of my questions, I'll often kind of bring up a basic evolutionary biological frame,
hmm
and um, Like it's almost met with like, what are you talking about? Like there's no connection there whatsoever.
Mhm.
And I think part of that is because there's a real fear of bringing it up at the biological level, that it's hard to parse out exactly, but it's antithetical to the fundamental agenda behind.
Well, okay, one of them is because biology is considered race essentialist and sexist.
Right, right.
And the second is that there is this Gnostic element which says, there's the secret self, which is like, and
Yeah,
especially, I
yeah.
mean, you're working mostly with trans people, weren't you?
I was at my last placement. Yeah.
Yeah,
Mm.
which I mean, that Gnostic element has become kind of a so have you heard of Brianna Wu?
Yes, I think so.
So she was when you were like a teenager, she was very involved in Gamergate.
That's right. Let me look up.
And yeah, she recently has been well, she recently came out
Oh
as trans.
yeah, that's right.
Yeah, she recently came out as trans. I highly recommend watching the video where she describes her experience as a
Mm.
as a child. Um, and she recently broke with the mainstream trans narrative. I don't know. So you guys were using WPath 8.
Yeah.
Have you read WPath 7?
No.
So when I went looking for WPath, I first found WPath 7 and I started reading it. And it was like, oh, this is like, this makes sense.
Right.
What like this is saying stuff that the current regime would lose their mind.
Yeah.
And then I realized, oh, this is double, and I went to look at the year, right? And it's like, oh, this is not the current version. And I went and looked up WPath 8.
Mm-mm.
Completely different. It between WPath 7 and WPath 8, they switched from being trans is a
Mental disorder.
it first of all is a mental disorder. It has physiological reasons for it, and you're going from one gender to the other
Yeah.
to, oh, this is like, there is no connection um, between gender expression and sex, and gender expression can be anything, and so it's that, like, it's night and day in some aspects, right?
Right. Right.
And frankly, I think if we could go back to WPath 7, we might actually be Fountain of Comfort logo quarter zip when that can be easily
Yeah,
arranged.
that's the easy part.
Yeah, that's the very easy part, right? Um, so yeah, how did we get onto, with Brianna Wu? She's kind of started coming to the forefront as a trans person, um, still very involved in democratic politics, who is like, no, I'm not going along with the orthodoxy anymore. That you guys have lost your mind, and you are risking serious political, because, I mean, some of the discussions I've been having on her Twitter thread include people, people just, all of the trans people they know are people who don't want to pass. And it's like, I don't know if your experience has been this, but most of the trans people I know just want to pass.
Yeah, that's the people you interact with in a day-to-day basis.
Yeah,
The type you're describing, I've only in like seen in online spaces, and the regular people that I interact with on a day-to-day basis is yeah. It,
they just want to pass. They
right,
tend
of
to have a
course.
lot of social anxiety. They don't want any attention being paid to them.
And they
Um,
especially want to figure out how to navigate a romantic relationship
yeah,
given their identity. Yep.
yeah,
That seems to be a primary concern.
right. As opposed to the people who are like, yeah, I can transition to being a male and still have children, and still give birth. And it's like, do you realize how contrary that is to most of the people who transition from female to male is wanting to give birth,
Right.
right? It's
Yeah.
like the,
But
generally,
that's an important difference between something like the activists versus
right.
the
And
majority of the trans population.
yeah, and
Yeah.
and those people, the activists, are causing a backlash where people are like, "There's no such thing as trans." Um, um, how much? I mean, you're not even allowed to say the words autogynephilia. I kind of think. Um, how much did you guys actually take a look at autogynephilia in where you were?
Not at all.
Not at all. Yeah. And so this is part of my thing is like, like obviously there's no one reason why every single person who may be trans feels that they're trans, including they may just be wrong about thinking that they are trans,
Yep.
right? And a lot of people on the right, the political right, have caught on to this idea of autogynephilia, like
Yeah.
Jan God here, right? And they just think that's the only explanation.
Yeah. Well, that's usually because their primary interactions with trans people are the activists,
Their
and
only interactions
and
with
they're
trans.
yeah, right. And honestly, it's the manner in which these online spaces around it just perpetuates so many problems, because it's so disconnected from what's going on the ground. But it's almost but it becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy, right? Because so a lot of trans people that I interacted with at Hartford Psychological Services, it's like they they kind of they would see that they weren't able to kind of get a voice for what they're going through in kind of like something like a average clinical setting, whatever that means. And they see all this online backlash from the conservative movement, and so then they even if they don't necessarily prescribe to it propositionally, they feel that their tribe is with the activists because it allows them to feel safe, and it provides a frame from which they feel like they can belong, even if that's not actually ideologically where they belong. I mean, you see this in all types of ideological, situations, but I think that's especially the case. And so then you get whatever these activists, they really are pushing the entirety of the community in directions simply because the trans community doesn't have a great direction. And so the activists just become the de facto head. That's at least what I noticed.
Yeah.
Because in the trans men and women group that I met, oftentimes they would describe this tension and they would be like, well, I don't think I really agree with that, but this person said that. And so, they kind of look to trans leaders and
Yeah. No, this is a huge problem. I mean, especially in Los Angeles.
oh, I can imagine.
but just to clarify, I think we're all agreed as far as fountain of comfort goes. Um, if you don't have an illness, you don't need therapy. If you don't have an illness, you don't need therapy. Like you shouldn't like it. So if you're telling me that something is not an illness, and I'll believe you, right? I mean, we don't treat people against their will, certainly, but treatment, especially medical treatment, surgical treatment, but I think there needs to be a very clear distinction between things like life coaching and spiritual counseling, and even just like grief counseling and mental health, like actual mental, and this is part of the hierarchy, right?
Yep.
That I keep on talking about having the distinction between, okay, does this person need a nutritionist and fitness coach, right? The equivalent of a nutritionist and fitness coach who can help you be more physically healthy than you are,
Yep.
right?
Yep.
Which in a mental health standpoint, I highly think support groups should be the first line there. Although, certainly, at least for some people, life coaching type counseling or spiritual counseling may be the way to go that way. And then there are people who actually need treatment. These people are ill. They need treatment by a professional. And that treatment needs, that intervention, psychological intervention, should not be something that is just handed out as if it's. You sometimes hear people being like, put antidepressants in the water, and it's like, no, do not do that. Same thing with actual psychological interventions. Please do not put them in the water. Do not aerosolize them. That's not how things should work. And too many people think that is how it should work.
Yeah. I mean, and then you have the whole issue where a lot of people actually just need community.
Yeah.
That like, and that tends to be a considerable number of clients that seek out therapy that they simply don't have community, and they're lonely, and they don't have a family network, they don't have a friend network, they don't have a community network, and they also don't have a kind of like a connected means by which they can participate in things that they're good at or that they enjoy.
Yeah.
And that to be fair, that it can often, for some people, depending on their situation, involve some significant problem solving. But I agree with you. That's kind of a very different issue. Mm-hmm. But they do it's tough though, because they do intersect, because that goes on long enough, and anxiety and depression, is knocking at the doorstep. I mean,
yeah.
And I think, but that partly speaks to the manner in which we fail people by not giving them what they need to address the particular issue, and then they kind of end up in a situation. It's like, oh, you need therapy. It's like, yeah, well, because the needs weren't properly addressed in the first place, and so now it's everything is being funneled into this mental health, which is kind of what you're speaking of.
Yeah. And frankly, I think social work is supposed to be better than psychology as an orientation in that manner.
Yep.
For people, yeah. But I have to say, despite the fact I think personal counseling is so much more fun than group work. Group work is a lot of work. It's very difficult. Yeah. I think it's more difficult to do it well than individual counseling.
You have to manage the dynamic implicitly, which is very difficult.
Yeah. And I think fewer people can do good group work. But I've basically come to think that unless you have a persistent, serious mental illness, you should be the first line of treatment, and certainly at least a line of treatment along with individual counseling should be some sort of support group.
I guess maybe I think, yeah, especially if it's, I've just seen so many poor support groups, but I know what you're saying. If it's run well, I think I would agree with that. Support groups need, part of the leader's job is to make it so that it isn't so mechanical, because a lot of groups are, and because the leader can't handle all of the entropy of dealing with a group, they make it very mechanical so as to make their job easier. But that's just cope for not having the skills in order to do it. And like, if that's whatever, that's what it is. But you're not going to be helping that with people. It's going to make people more cynical about the treatment process, because rather than coming for genuine human connection, which is a huge part of what's going on behind the scenes in support groups, you're actually kind of depriving them of that. I mean, it's yeah.
I was I mean, when I first started doing a group, they had me start by being a second facilitator to somebody else who was doing a group, and she had a PowerPoint presentation and just read from it. That was it.
Yep.
And then she had an activity that was supposed to be an activity, but like, it was like, oh my God, this is not in any way
like a faculty meeting.
Yeah, it's not. It is not a therapeutic group at all. Yeah. But
right.
I mean, I really do think part of the problem is I actually had one of my professors, and this wasn't in my master's degree, but I had one of my professors say, there's no such, the only requirement for a competent therapist is that they be breathing.
Okay.
And it's like, really? I mean, so what he meant was, therapy has been shown to work even if the therapist knows nothing. And
I can believe that.
Yeah. And there is definitely a it is very difficult to measure competence in psychotherapy. I really don't think that has anything to do with it. Yeah, he says you don't give a plumber the king's therapist, and you don't give the king the plumber's therapist. I really don't think that's. So we were talking about, the difference between a crisis counselor, somebody who works at a state hospital, and somebody who's doing private practice, outpatient stuff, right? Yep. Inpatient is very different from outpatient, because by the time you're an inpatient, right, you've got serious persistent mental illness, right?
Yep.
And that's just so different from that average person who's like feeling depressed and decides to go see a therapist.
Yeah. Yeah, I think so. From my experience, a lot of times people stop at those earlier inroads, whether it be a support group or something like as you were calling it earlier, first world therapy,
First
or
world
something,
problems, yeah.
first world problem therapy, and they're not adequately diagnosed. And I don't mean necessarily like in a DSM clinical way, but adequately diagnosed in terms of what is the proper manner in which what they're kind of coming to therapy for is assessed. And then it kind of can compound. And then you're obviously not with a lot of people, but then you're in an inpatient situation oftentimes. And that's kind of particularly what I feel of a special interest in, is mitigating that process, because I've seen so many people spiral in a particular direction, and there's implicit things that happen oftentimes in the first world problem therapy that lead people to the inpatient. It like actually contributes to them in that direction, because there's not this differentiation that you're talking about, and it's everybody gets grouped into one, and that there's this process in which it's all actually being funneled in that way, and people start to think about their problems in a way that makes them head towards a direction of inpatient. And you see this happen, and then sorting it out at that level is much more difficult than if you had interacted with a person when they first came in. But so connecting this to Fountain of Comfort, what that requires is that requires who this person is initially pursuing to have something like a frame that is outside of this very narrow way in which a lot of clinicians are being trained to think about mental health, and to be thinking about the human person in general. And if they don't have that broader frame, and they only think the manner in which human beings solve problems in their lives is through something like this medical complex, then we're doomed.
Yeah. I mean, ultimately, when we're talking about Fountain of Comfort, so my hope for Fountain of Comfort is that it will be a community of people who are members of this community, who at various times may have a mental illness, may have need for mental health services. But the fountain's there for you to take a drink from whenever you need a drink. Maybe even like a community well, right? People go and get pails of water when they need it.
Mm-hmm.
Right? And because the way we have, so in substance abuse work, we talk about the identified patient. Oh, and actually, so Jason, you know Jason Schweitzer, right?
Yep.
His girlfriend has her father's a therapist.
Okay.
And she did these discussions with him because she found herself in a codependent relationship with an addict. And so I saw these videos where they were discussing it, and one of the things he said, which I hadn't heard before, but I can totally see, is there's an average of 12 codependents for each addict.
Okay.
And we talk in substance abuse work, we talk about the identified patient.
Yeah.
So he gave this analogy of a mobile, right? And he's like, well, you have the mobile, and then you move one piece and everything starts moving, right?
Yeah. Yep.
And people really have this. So when people talk about codependency, they usually really misunderstand the term. A codependent is someone who is also addicted to your addiction.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yep.
It's not that you two are addicted to each other, which is how most people think two codependent people, like they're dependent on each other. They don't realize, no, there's one person who's dependent, right, on a substance, and then there's other people who are codependent, meaning they're not actually alcoholics or not, abusers of substances themselves, but their framework is around your addiction.
Yes. And honestly, that's it's a good way of understanding the way sin works. Well, because the way that you were describing it, that generally people think as this kind of codependency for each other, if you don't have a frame of the manner in which sin, in the way that it is like a sickness and a contagion, then you would think about it that way.
It pollutes, yes,
exactly. But and so if you don't have that frame, then it makes sense to think about it like in terms of, because you don't understand sin as something like an ontological reality, and so it has to be kind of found within the two persons. But if you understand that sin is something that can move through, and that it is much more, it has much more of a reality than simply something like this abstract, wrong, right kind of thing, then you miss the manner in which it interacts with people and the way in which it actually spreads. And I think this, to your point about the fountain that people can come to, is a community, a traditional community, let's say, recognizes this, because so much of the manner in which a community is able to exist is dependent upon keeping contagion out of the community so that the community can thrive. And traditional people understood that the contagion, in a symbolic manner, that it stretches everything down to the physical, or the material rather, all the way up into the spiritual, and that those intersected in ways. And so your water being polluted is a fundamental communal concern.
Yes.
And to pinpoint it at the individual level is then a misapprehension of the way contagion works. And that's partly what I see as such an important frame when talking about what Fountain of Comfort is trying to do, paradigmatically at least.
Yeah. So we think, oh, there's this person who has a mental illness. You saw the definition of mental illness that what's his name gave, Jordan Peterson.
In what?
It was during his he was discussing he was on Joe Rogan, and he said, I quote, "Mental health is the harmony of your existence in relationship to the future and other people." Mental health is the harmony of your existence in relationship to the future and other people. And one of the ways I put it is sanity is not contained in your skull. Sanity is contained in your relationships with others.
Yeah, it's relational fundamentally. Yeah.
And
you can't assess sanity without an other.
Yeah. So that professor I was talking to you about, who I showed you the video of, one of his quips is, how do you know if someone is crazy? Because they make you crazy when you talk to them.
Yeah.
Right. And so this idea that, oh, this person has the mental illness or this person has the addiction, right? If you treat one of the codependents, if you treat the wife of an alcoholic, the alcoholic is more likely to get better.
Yep. And honestly, having the wisdom to kind of see where the in a network of codependency, seeing where the best possible, I hate to word it this way, but like see where the best possible in is actually
Intervention. Yeah.
yeah, is actually really valuable.
Yeah.
Because instead of wasting time with the person that is at the end of the stack of dominoes, you can
Yeah.
knock over the first one. It's more complicated than that, but um, you you transform in the way that's about selecting who is going to be the person that is like the linchpin in terms of transformation.
Yeah.
And that requires, in some sense, also an understanding of hierarchy in terms of a family system, in terms of how each family member is dependent upon others by virtue of the way that it's a system, or whether it be a community. It doesn't have to be a family. All of that requires this frame that doesn't exist within the type of education you and I are receiving. And that's
Well,
largely because
it doesn't, but it does. I mean, we spend so much time talking about systems and macro and micro and right,
I know,
but
but I
we don't actually
we're
apply.
missing that.
We don't actually reply. Yeah. No, I think Jasberg here is right. Um, there is no private sin. Your sin pollutes your environment.
Yeah, right.
Yeah, your sin really does pollute your environment. It it touches the other people you're involved in because there are no atomistic individuals.
Right. Yeah, Jonathan Peugeot talks about this he's not talking about it in this particular way, but he talks about the pattern of people moving from a rural community towards a city to privatize their sin, but it doesn't actually end up working because then the city ends up it's a contagion within the city, and then the city ends up having to kind of clamp down on it, which then creates the same reaction. And so the city ends up becoming like this false paradise for you, a way for you to privatize your sin, but it ultimately doesn't work. So I guess given that, before we went on stream, you were talking about how you'd want to have Vervaeke on. Given what we were just talking about, how do you see him interacting with this at all? If that's not what you were thinking, I wanted to talk more about what you wanted to talk to him about with.
I think this is what he is in fact getting at. He started with trying to psychologically treat the individual, and he started realizing it's not about the individual.
Yeah, right. You can follow that.
Yeah. That has been his trajectory of okay, I want to help heal people from their suffering. Oh, I can't do it by just this one person.
Yep.
I mean, Sandy's asking about family systems. The fact is, when you help any individual in a family system, it should make the entire family system better. I think the exception to that is part of the problem with individual therapy as we have it. Is we will, if someone's in a dysfunctional system, we will encourage them to leave the dysfunctional system, which might not be the best thing for them, but could be the best thing for them. And sometimes that leaves the system even worse off than it was before.
Well, that's what I was going to say. It's like, I agree with you. I think that there is a manner in which it should help the system, but it depends on how you're looking at it. If you're looking at it for something like this, just immediate chain reaction of healing in the way that you're kind of expecting, you aren't always going to see that. So like, for example, especially so let's say you have a problematic family system, and you're able
And
to.
let's make clear, every family system has problems.
Oh, of course.
Yeah, nobody's perfect. Everything has problems, but like you need a system that's dysfunctional enough to end up with somebody who's like an actual alcoholic or serious
Which is why you judge these things by functionality. Even though it's not a perfect way of doing it, you assess based off of functionality, because if you do it any other way, then it's too abstracted. How is it behaviorally negatively affecting you in your life and your goals and all those things? But let's say you have some inroads with the child, and the child can start working on things, because the child's relationship with the parents it's like backwards up the hierarchy. Then you oftentimes aren't going to see the parents like transform in a way you would if you had like gotten the father and done it like that. But so you could just say, well, damned be the parents, but that's actually not the case, because the child is still implicitly working within the parents in ways that are hard to explicate, and that's really, really important. And a lot of healing
there's
can
a
be done in
limit
that way.
to how healthy a child can be with dysfunctional parents.
Yeah. Yep. And yeah, rightly so. You have to have a certain level of, you have to be able to see that process can take place, that be by fixing the child, that you don't have to, but that's partly that it does require a type of faith, because the jump being made there is one of faith in the way that we're talking about the way these things are related. Because similarly to the way people often miss that implicit way in which sin is a contagion, that actually requires a type of faith as well. And so therefore also it requires a type of faith for the opposite process of healing to occur, because of the way in which these things are interrelated.
Yeah.
But yeah, I mean, so I guess I'm gonna have to go in like 15, 20 minutes. Was there other things that we wanted to touch upon in terms of, I mean, I don't remember. We talked about so many different things before we jumped on. But
we did. I mean, frankly, when it comes to Fountain of Comfort, I think an important component for me is the economics, right? Right now, the economic system that we have is somebody gets diagnosed with a mental illness, their insurance or they pay for therapy for their mental illness. And that's supposed to fix it. And that creates really horrible incentive structures.
Yep.
Whereas if you consider it to be kind of like sanitation, right? You want public garbage collection, and you hire actual mental health workers. And this goes so much against most of the American ethos, which is, especially, you can't do this. Like, if I were to suggest that the city of Los Angeles just hire social workers, well, we actually do that here in Los Angeles. We have government social workers whose job it is to like improve the mental health of the community, and it's a joke, I have to say.
Connecticut has something similar.
Yeah, it's what you really need to have is communities, and frankly, I would say religious communities, need to recognize, we have mental health needs in our community, and frankly, have it hopefully be pastor guided and community funded.
So here's a question I have for you that might get into the weeds a little bit. But why? So from my experience, there seems to be within different religious communities a wide variety of responses to what the proper involvement is. Yeah, that was a good comment from Joseph.
Yeah.
I agree with that. Like what is the proper level of interaction and participation in the mental health space? It's something that I see that a lot of people within religious communities seem to have very strong opinions about.
Mm-hmm.
And the people that I've dialogued with it about it generally hasn't gone too well. and I'm not even trying to even have an agenda. I'm more just trying to like kind of figure out what the bridge is
Mm-hmm.
that I can kind of properly. But I haven't been able to kind of figure out. There seems to be, and I see this even in this Jordan Peterson sphere, is I see that a lot of the disagreements people have are disagreements that have to do with what is the linguistic frame by which we're talking about a problem in. And that like that boils down to so many of the problems that it's like almost wild to me.
Yeah.
Like, can't you just see that you're talking about, I get that it's different. I do. And I'm not downplaying the difference. But we can recognize difference while also seeing unity. Like
Yeah.
that's how you have to have a conversation in general. That's how you do anything.
Yeah.
Is
Yeah.
maintaining the balance between those two. But everyone wants their linguistic frame, and I think that speaks to what you were saying before we got on stream. Why you see the manner in which the Jordan Peterson sphere is breaking it into its different enclaves, because it's like, no, my language is the language. And
Okay. Yeah.
do you understand what I'm saying?
I totally understand what you're saying. Just to read, Yosef is the president of the board of directors. He says, we know from systems theory that if you optimize for one component of the system, you degrade the performance of the system as a whole. This is a fundamental trade-off we need to remember regarding therapy and health of individuals as opposed to health of systems. And ultimately, I think we need to be working first and foremost for the health of the system, not the health of any one individual. We are not atomistic individuals. As to what you're talking about, your symbolic framework, your what Jung would call a hierarchy of values and priorities, ultimately instantiates itself. And I mean, this is like ideal and hypostasis, right? There's the hypostatic union, right, of how your
Someone clip that. No.
how you're conceiving of what this is and how it instantiates itself and how it interacts with its environment, certainly how it interacts with you, right? This is a pen, this is a pointer, right? If I look at this and I see pointer as opposed to pen, I am going to hold it differently. And so
structural functional relationship.
Yes. And ultimately, I think while I hope, at least through Vervaeke's project of this Silk Road, we we might be able to continue our dialogue. I think Fountain of Comfort, at least because of the interactions between Eastern Orthodox Christianity and Orthodox Judaism, will be able to maintain the relationship that we have. Father Stephen has been more supportive of this project than I ever expected.
So you consider those tweets you were showing me a fluke, hopefully.
Well, I know for a fact at least half of those likes came from Eastern Orthodox Christians.
Well, there you go.
The relationship that we as an Orthodox Jewish community have been able to build with the Eastern Orthodox community has been a much closer relationship. Although I have to say the relationship with the Catholic community is actually pretty strong because of the work of Father Eric, right? And maybe the thing is, I mean, Father Eric has his own thing going more, and Catholic Charities is its own thing, etc. I don't know, but the interface with the Protestant world is breaking down. I see that, and ultimately, I think it's going to have to, because the Protestants have enough problems interfacing with themselves, with each other, that I don't see how they interface with Catholicism. Look, if they can't deal with Father Eric well, which I don't think TLC has done even a semi-adequate job of interacting, and you see it, I mean, in the political sphere between the Protestants, Christian nationalists, and the Catholic integralists. They can't even talk to each other, right? And because the political, and let's face it, ultimately the political affects, like, yes, the political is now, the religious is always. We live in the now. We don't live in the always, right? And right now, what the situation is because we can't have these discussions as fruitfully and as productively and as practically and functionally as we need to. Yeah, I do see TLC falling apart, and I do see ultimately, from everything I've been able to see, Fountain of Comfort, I'm not even sure will be able to interface well with the Catholic part, although it has to some extent. I don't see Protestants really getting on board with this, partially because so many Protestants don't believe mental illness exists. Like, there is a serious and important contingent of the Reformed polity who don't believe there is such a thing as mental illness.
Mm. Yeah. I mean, in some sense, they're in the breakdown. I saw you posted something the other day. The protest eventually has to end.
Yeah.
And I responded to you, and I commented that I think if there's ever been a time, the time is now. We'll see, but I guess what I'm interested in is what is the disconnect? What is at the point? What is the disconnect between? Because it's not so much that they're not going to see that, like, the whole issue of them seeing whether or not mental health is a thing.
Mm-hmm.
there's something to me, and I can't put my finger on what it is, but that's upstream from that, that's causing the block, that I think is worthy of investigating.
Yeah, there's a
Do you understand what? Yeah, that's very high.
It
Exactly.
is.
It's theological, and
It's theological, but part of the problem is that Protestants don't have a unified theology.
right, right.
Right? Is Gage Catholic? I don't know. Gage, are you Catholic?
No.
Are you turning Eastern Orthodox?
A lot of people tend to think so.
A lot of people.
I've talked to so many people that say, who hear me talk for a while, and then they say, "Oh, it's inevitable. Stop resisting it."
I hate to say it, even though you're officially our Protestant member of the board of directors.
So much for that. I guess I'm not bridging any gaps anymore. I was supposed to be a part of this bridge.
Yeah.
I guess the bridge is crumbling. No, but
I think it's possible that maybe the Anglicans might be able to, but like, if you don't have a hierarchy that is, large enough, and I guess the denominations somewhat do, but like, is the CRC really ready to work mental health with Fountain of Comfort? I don't know.
Yeah, there's not enough surety in their own theology in order to be able to take it in. It's something like that. Because so much of it is compensatory, and so much of it comes from like a place of fragility over their own theological positions, that they're constantly having to assess whether or not different schools of thought are opponents or not, in this kind of very childish way. And that's what happens when you don't have something more firm, because it's like, when you have that, you don't have to worry so much about how this framework is some sort of a fundamental challenge to the Catholic Church or something like that. Like you can deal with it in a much more responsible way, the way an adult would, because the adult has a fortitude of identity that a child doesn't.
Yeah.
But I'm also not interested in just bashing the Protestant perspective in it, because, well, maybe it's because I still am Protestant to some extent, but I also think too easily Protestantism just gets dismissed for its ridiculousness and doesn't adequately address why it exists in the first place.
I think Protestantism is really good at conquering new territory.
Right. Well, it's an extension that, if properly working, the extension loves that which it's extending from, and so therefore it shouldn't be properly construed as a protest.
But
right.
But yeah,
but it's hard to do that. It's hard to do that without it being a protest, and that's
and there's a fracturing, and there's an inconsistency, and there's an incoherence that allows it without shape. Like, it's liquid. It's more liquid.
Yeah.
Right.
And that's why I increasingly find it a place from which I'm not able to stand, which is exactly why people will say when I talk that Eastern Orthodoxy is inevitable, because it's like, I don't have a place to stand. But part of my resistance I attend Eastern Orthodox services fairly regularly, but part of my resistance to making that official in any real sense is because I'm also, this is partly my own way of processing it, but unwilling to lose the value that comes from the liquid that you're speaking of. It's like, like, and people assure me that you don't have to lose that, but I don't know. I'm not convinced yet of that being the case, and I think that liquid that you're pointing to is important, very important, especially right now.
Well, I have said, and I continue to say, that if you're Eastern Orthodox in the West, you're already a Protestant.
But at least you have some solid ground to stand on. Yeah.
Like, because if you're actually going to be not a Protestant, like, you'll just be Catholic. Like, if you're saying, well, the filioque, I can't.
Let me be honest. It's not about the filioque. So, I know that is for some, but that's not it. That's not the linchpin for me.
Well, there's also Pope Francis. But if you're saying Pope Francis, it's like you're being Protestant, right?
Yeah.
Right. Whatever it is, right? Whereas the real Eastern Orthodox ethos is, I'm just going to go to the church that everybody goes to, right? Because in Eastern Orthodox countries, right, that's just the church that's there.
Yep.
And the church that's here for you is the Catholic Church.
Like, right? What you're saying, what that looks like as in the West.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, I'm glad I'm not in your position. And frankly, I mean, if we're really talking about it, ultimately, I think everybody's going to have to recognize that they need to become Noahides, and like the rabbis have it all down. Well, and that'll fix everything.
You remind me, going to your commentary on Matthew's video, the way you just said that, I'm glad I'm not in your shoes, reminds me of the way in which he was talking about how he's glad he's not in your shoes. But we're talking about it in the opposite ways.
Yeah.
He's not my problem, and you're saying this isn't, and that's fair, honestly. Both of the two are not each other's problem.
Ultimately, so it's funny. There are people who go to Eastern Orthodox churches because they are Noahides who believe that they should follow the guidance of Orthodox Jewish rabbis, which is not how an Eastern Orthodox priest would like their congregants to be, right? That's not like, these people believe that I am a priest of God, and because I am a priest of God, they're going to an Eastern Orthodox church, right?
Yeah. And some of that thinking is even just speaks to how foreign traditional ways of like my Protestant brain is just like short-circuiting at that. I mean,
but Garth, the ultimate Protestant move.
Well, fair enough, but Garth brings up something interesting that factors into my thinking too. He said the church that everyone goes to category can definitely fit for Protestant churches in America, and that's also part of it for me. There's something, Protestantism is that which brought me, it's my forefathers in some real sense. And so I believe in the value of not just cutting from your forefathers when you just, do you understand what I'm saying? There's a particular plot line that's being played out that I wonder if I'm best to be a part of rather than to just leave it. Do you understand? Like, I mean, these are questions I don't have the answer to. These are things I'm trying to figure out. But
I mean, and ultimately, you're going to have to make that decision. But I don't think so. There's a lot of people who think that if you, as a Protestant, go back to, for example, a Catholic church, you are turning your back on the Reformation, which, if you know what the Catholic Church was like before the Reformation, it's like, no, this is not the Catholic Church pre-Reformation that you're going back to.
Yeah, right.
You are going to a Reformed Catholic Church.
Correct. Right. Yeah. Yeah. No,
I mean, these Catholic churches have Bible studies, for God's sake.
Yeah. I mean, maybe I'm gonna, maybe it'll happen, and I'll be like, "What's the difference?"
Have you actually been to a Catholic church?
Once.
Mm.
Yeah, I mean, my family's. I'm Irish, but I don't know that side of my family very well.
You're Irish, yeah.
My dad's from England, but he is Irish because his parents moved from Ireland to England when before he was born. But my mom's side are Mayflower English. So they were Protestants through and through.
They're the important ones, I see.
Yeah, and I'm New England to the bones, and so there's a real Puritan thread there, and there's some interesting things. I have some.
You must have some Unitarians in your blood.
Maybe. I have some significant Native American blood as well.
Really?
From my grandmother's side, yeah. You can't really see it too much in my facial structure, but in my grandmother's facial structure, it's much more apparent.
I would actually investigate that because you want to maintain registration if you can.
I think it's a 16th that I have. Algonquin.
Yeah, some it depends on the tribe, but some tribes will allow you to register up to 1/16. Some will allow you to register at anything.
Yeah, I should look into that. My grandmother was she she couldn't walk when she was a child, and her mother kind of, because her mother's father was Algonquin. And she used a lot of Native American remedies to supposedly heal my grandmother, and she was able to walk. So that's just a significant kind of story within my family that is also worthy of considering. It's very important to me that I balance between extending my family identity while also continuing it. Do you know what I mean? I think that's the manner in which you move forward in the world. We don't want to recreate the wheel. That's one of the things
that's one of my big things. I like people who recreate the wheel. Like, it's like, what are you doing with your life?
Yeah, no, and I agree with that sentiment that you have in a lot of ways. It's like you said, you don't envy my problem. So there you go. There's nothing else to say. And I guess I don't envy yours either. So
yeah. Well, you have to go.
Yeah.
Was there anything you wanted to talk about before you went?
I mean, other than just, we should do this more frequently. It's been a while since we've done something like this.
We should. Yeah, I was actually looking at the channel and it's been pretty vacant. Like,
yeah, right.
Yeah.
So let's definitely make a concerted effort to do that, and then let me know. Let me know, because I would, if you'd want, I'd love to be a part of that. Yeah. So and we can talk about what that would look like more specifically, but yeah, if it works out, it works out. Because I know there was at one point you had wanted him on, maybe for different reasons, but yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, okay, cool. But yeah, no, I mean, good luck in your program, and we'll talk soon.
Good luck with yours. Fountain of Comfort is still going. Please feel free, people, to donate. Not many people have, but and we haven't spent any of the money, although we kind of have, but we haven't actually spent any of the money people have donated. We like so far, all of the costs I've just been covering by myself, and eventually I will ask for those to be reimbursed, but probably once people see some value out of this.
I
Hey,
think, and I think that speaks to the value of perhaps seeing the way in which Vervaeke might interact with it, because I think, and perhaps, like you said, the manner in which Vervaeke's thinking has kind of evolved.
yeah,
It wouldn't have been as viable to him maybe even a few years ago. So
quite
I,
likely.
where his thought is right now seems a lot in line with what we're talking about in terms of what if the fountain is the
Yeah,
center of the community. So,
yeah.
all right.
Sure. Bye, people.